are some moments in your life you remember forever. Your first heartbreak, your first job, your first time reading Shakespeare during high school. For most people, Shakespeare, or more generally poetry, reminds them of unpleasant memories from English class. You remember the teacher explaining how the glass cracking is a metaphor for the poet's love for life. You scratch your head and exclaim, "Why can't poets just say what they mean?" before vowing to never read poetry again. Poetry can feel incredibly inaccessible, written in a way that makes no sense to ordinary people. But what if I told you that despite this, I was one of the few people in the class who loved Shakespeare, poetry, all of it? Did I understand what the metaphors meant or the nuances of the rhyming structure? No, but I love poetry nonetheless. The magic of poetry is not rooted in understanding its complexities. And I say that with confidence, given that my love for poetry started at just 5 years of age. It was one of those things I had a natural affinity toward, despite not growing up in an artistic household. My first poem was in Malayalam, a language from the south of India, and I titled it Vinu, which roughly translates to fallen in English. And don't be fooled into thinking that that title had a deeper meaning. The poem revolved around my mum tripping over herself, followed by my dad, and me coming to save them. Over time, though, poetry became, and still is, a creative outlet for me. I view poetry as an art form that uses words as a medium for self-expression. Understanding poetry is often perceived as the cornerstone of enjoying it. But this doesn't seem to extend to other art forms. Let's take visual art as an example. I'm sure you've walked into an art gallery or museum and wandered through the various pieces on display. It's easy to decipher the meaning of some pieces, others not so much. But there is this sense of serenity when walking through an art gallery, surrounded by beauty that surpasses understanding. You don't have to understand the painting to appreciate the colours, the strokes, and the effort the artist has put into creating such a stunning piece. Music is an art form that is universally appreciated and enjoyed. You can enjoy the rhythm, the melody, and the amalgamation of sounds without listening to the lyrics. In fact, music has the power to transcend languages. While I speak Malayalam, I have never understood the lyrics of a Malayalam song. I don't need to understand the lyrics, though, to be transported by the stunning instrumentals, melodies, and rhythm. Just like visual art and music, you can find enjoyment, independent of understanding, in poetry. Here are 2 ways you can begin. The first is appreciating the imagery that poetry offers. Imagery provides the visual aspect to poetry. These images in your head can be as beautiful as a painting. You can see the clouds dancing across the blue sky without knowing what that metaphor means. The second is paying attention to the rhythm of a poem. There is an inherent rhythm to all poems, even in free verse poetry, which refers to poetry that does not follow a rigid structure. The rhythm is the general sense of flow, rather than the strictly poetic definition, which includes many aspects such as the beat or stress of a poem. It's how the poem sounds, what the general movement of it is when spoken aloud. And, depending on who is reading the poem, it'll sound different. They might choose to pause longer after a particular line, or emphasize certain words. I want to illustrate these 2 aspects with an example. The following is a poem by Sarojini Naidu, a notable politician and poet of India. She fought for India's independence and was known as the Nightingale of India due to the lyrical nature of her poems. Pay attention to the images and the rhythm, Do not seek to understand the complexities. Just let the words wash over you. This poem is called Song of a Dream. Once in the dream of a night I stood, lone in the light of a magical wood, soul deep in visions that poppy-like sprang, and spirits of truth were the birds that sang, and spirits of love were the stars that glowed, and spirits of peace were the streams that flowed, in that magical wood, in the land of sleep. Lone in the light of that magical grove, I felt the stars of the spirits of love gather and gleam round my delicate youth. And I heard the song of the spirits of truth. To quench my longing, I bent me low by the streams of the spirits of peace that flow, in that magical wood, in the land of sleep. Have a think about this poem. What did you see? What did you hear? How did it make you feel? This poem has beautiful images of a magical grove, birds, poppies, stars, and streams. It also rhymes and has a mesmerizing rhythm. But what does it mean? The first time I read this poem, I didn't understand its deeper meaning. Now, I don't want to say that meaning is unimportant. Meaning helps us to feel connected to art. This poem describes what Mrs. Naidu dreamt for India. She dreamt of a world where truth, love, and peace prevailed. Meaning helps deepen the experience of reading a poem, but it doesn't indicate a failure if you don't understand it the first, the second, or even the fifth time, or even if you never understand it at all. And it's not wrong to look up the meaning of a poem. There is a great joy and power that comes with feeling seen by a poem. I reconnected with that feeling over a year ago, at a time in my life where I felt utterly lost. I was on a gap year after realizing that my childhood dream of becoming a doctor was not the dream I wanted as an adult. For the first time in my life, I had stepped off the well-trodden path and grappled with all the uncertainty, fear, and doubt that came with it. Fortunately, there was somebody who knew me better than I knew myself. My YouTube algorithm. It had picked up on my increased consumption of self-help videos and career advice, suggesting, believe it or not, a TEDx talk. Inspired by the talk, I purchased the speaker's book of poetry. I consumed those pages faster than any poetry I'd ever read. It felt as if they had taken my thoughts and feelings right out of my head and distilled them into cohesive poems. The fact that a stranger could articulate my feelings better than I ever could reminded me that I was not alone. And thanks to that book, reading poetry became less of a thing I did every few months and something I do every day. When I first told people my topic for this talk, many replied, "Oh, so nothing related to what you study then?" I disagree. I study computer science, and I would say poetry has a lot to do with how you write code. Without boring you with the details, writing code is an art itself. There are principles and patterns programmers follow to create beautiful, or what's referred to as clean code. And that's the beauty of poetry. You start to read poetry, and the poems of the world unfold. Visual art is poetry manifested in physical form. Dance is poetry in motion. Music is the voice of poetry as it speaks to your heart. Poetry is 100 people in the room today with their own stories on pause as they listen to one voice. Poetry can be a mirror, but it can also be a lens through which we see the world, and that is the true magic of poetry. Poetry helps us to stand still It forces the mind to stand still. I challenge you to read a poem every day, or at least every week. You don't have to read poetry like fiction books in one sitting. Just 10 minutes is enough. And if you don't know where to start, you could read poetry from your time to ensure the language is familiar. Or maybe you would find it useful to reflect on what it is you want to read about. When I started reading poetry, I had to think about what it is that I wanted to read. I love nature, so I found an article listing nature poets and started there. Maybe you'd like to read a haiku, a short Japanese poem consisting of only 3 lines. Or maybe you want to jump straight into the works of Emily Dickinson and Maya Angelou. Or maybe you do want to revisit those high school memories of the Raven and reciting the lines, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Ultimately, it's up to you where you want to begin. As you tread further along the path of poetry, you will gain confidence and interest in the vast oceans of our history and the incredible depths of the human experience. As American poet Mary Oliver once said, "Poetry is a life-cherishing force. For poems are not words after all, but fires for the cold, ropes let down to the lost, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry." Thank you.